Hello, welcome back to the ABEI Webinar Series. My name is Mariana Bofarini. I'm president of ABEI, the Brazilian Association of Irish Studies, which aims at spreading Irish literature and culture throughout Brazil. To learn more about ABEI, please visit our website, www.abeibrasil.org. The ABEI Webinar Series are free open access online seminars offered by the Brazilian Association of Irish Studies as an opportunity for scholars from Brazil and abroad to share their work and research that is related to Irish studies. It is a great honor to be hosting the 7th webinar on Irish poetry titled A Talk Between the Poet Victoria Kennefick and Professor Gisele Wolkoff. Dr. Wolkoff from Fluminense Federal University will introduce Victoria Kennefick and steer the discussion. A certificate will be offered upon registration on the Even3 platform through the link in the description box. I would like, of course, to thank our guest speakers, especially Victoria for her being available to share her work with us, and Gisele, who helped us organize this event, as well as Vitor Augusto Pacheco, Camila Franco Batista, and Caroline Moreira Eufrauzino. And of course, to all those who are watching us, our most heartfelt thanks. Don't forget to leave your questions and comments in the chat. I hope you will enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariana. Thank you very much, Victoria Kennefick, for taking the time for being with us. Big thank you, especially because it's evening already there for you. And I also want to thank Alan Brennick and Carcanet Press. You know, Carcanet Press has always been very supportive to our actions, and Mariana and all the staff, ABEI staff, thank you. Vitor Augusto for the tech support to our session, and for all of you who are watching. So welcome to Brazil, Victoria. And I have to say, though, that Victoria Kennefick is a poet, a writer, a doctor in English from University College Cork, a teacher, and a woman born in Kennefick, County Cork, and now is based in County Kerry. Her first collection, Eat or We Both Starve, was first published in March this year by Carcanet Press. As I said, you have the link in our YouTube description here. And that's when I had the brilliant opportunity of listening to her for the first time. And since then, acknowledging about her work. She won many important prizes for her pamphlet, White Whale, first published in 2015, won the Munster Literature Centre Food for Poetry chapbook, a competition, and many others. And her work has appeared in many poetry reviews, among which are the Poetry Review, Poetry Ireland Review, The Stinging Fly, the Irish Times, and elsewhere. I found in her blog the link to the latest edition of Poetry Birmingham Literary Festival Journal, which brings 3 poems by her that are Hedgehog Practices Being a Girl, Mastication Resolution, and Day 27. And I recommend all of you watching to go take a look at the poet's blog, whose link is again in the description of our YouTube video here. Kennefick is also recipient of a Next Generation Artist Award from the Arts Council of Ireland, and she has received bursaries from Kerry County Council and Words Ireland. So once again, welcome, Poet Victoria Kennefick. Welcome to Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be here. I only wish it wasn't virtual, but this will certainly do in the meantime. And thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor.
It's a great pleasure. Well, I have to say, for those who are watching us for the first time about this session, that the book Eat or We Both Starve, as I said, published by Carcanet Press, is a book of 51 poems dedicated to Una, Victoria's mother, and that starts with a quotation from Ovid's Metamorphoses that reads, "What wickedness to swallow flesh into our own flesh, to fatten our greedy bodies by cramming in other bodies, to have one living creature fed by the death of another." And then it goes on, You cannot appease the hungry cravings of your wicked, gluttonous stomachs, except by destroying some other life. This quotation is in dialogue with an episode in your life, which is when you decided to become a vegetarian at the age of 6, and it reflects the person and the poet's view on life on planet Earth, being part of an animal kingdom in which there should be no power coming from hierarchical positions among species. This is suddenly a state-of-the-art theme nowadays with studies on speciesism, and also, I don't know if you'd like to say a few words about it, how I'm curious about your creative process and the themes chosen, and this is one of the themes I wanted to start our session with.
The meaty stuff, Gisele. I think really that becoming a vegetarian at such a young age and having that sudden awareness that we ate animals, as basic and obvious as that sounds, was a real coming of age moment for me. I often think of it almost as the end of my innocence, or certainly the beginning of the end of my innocence. And I had 2 very important moments where maybe 3 even, that I realized that we as human beings benefited from the deaths of other animals. The first was my grandmother put me up on her knee and we looked out the window, and in the fields next to our house there were lambs ambling, and I was delighted by them. I mean, there's nothing more beautiful than lambs dancing around the field. And all of a sudden she said, soon they will be on our table. And I can still remember that moment, the crushing realization that lamb was lamb. And this was, from a girl, I suppose, who very much enjoyed meat and like would have sucked marrow from, the bones of meat. Like I used to have liver for breakfast. I was very comfortable eating meat. And this sudden realization, coupled with going to the English market, one of my poems, Meat, is about that. We have a lovely covered-in food market in Cork City, and you go there and, everything is very fresh. So at Christmas time, the turkeys were hanging upside down with their purple eyelids. And that moment, along with the moment with the lamb, and indeed living in Ballycotton or near Ballycotton, which is a fishing village, I remember seeing young boys around this time fishing and taking out a fish from the water and banging its head off the side of the pier. And those 3 images are like absolutely seared into my brain. And I think it took me a long time to see that issue, if you like, around food and guilt and a hierarchical structure in terms of, the creatures of the world, that was such a driving force behind my writing. It took me a very long time to go back there and say, oh, that was when I realized, the true nature of death. That was when I realized about, change, puberty, the birth and death cycle, the beginning of, I suppose, my waking up, in a sense, into a more adult world.
Well, that's great. And we are happy you came up with a poem that can translate that feeling, and that with poems that talk about the issue that nowadays is a little bit more aware from the social perspective. It's more part of our social awareness. I mean, now I also kept thinking on how much you researched. I mean, you researched considerably about historical women, especially women who self-starved, the idea of communing with Christ, which is a rooted concept in Catholicism, and which connects with some Buddhist monks' actions to purify the spirit through pain. Of course, there's some similarity there between Christianity and some trends of Buddhism. Of course, some of these women, such as Catherine of Siena, Angela Follina, Veronica Giuliani, and Gemma Galgani, appear in Eat or We Both Starve, as much as actresses Mary Tyler Moore and Audrey Hepburn, and grandmother in Valina Mono. So would you say that they are your influences? And here I'm thinking about belonging to the Irish tradition of poets, being a woman writer after Evan Boland and the new rich generation of women poets after Boland, and after all, influences go beyond the literary ones, as we know. Even though I loved acknowledging about the poem, Perhaps the World Ends Here, which you quote from Joy Harjo, and this was totally new to me in your writings. I think the most striking passage in the poem Hunger Strikes Gemma Galgani is in the footnote on page 80, and I quote, "All night I dream of food. Jesus, take my taste from me. Rip out my tongue, and I will expiate through my bleeding for you all the sins committed by you, by your shrouded man." On that same note about influences, I believe the poem on the publication of Les Terres du Ciel, in that poem we have access to your belief in life on earth, and again the role of the writer, particularly in the last 3 lines, which read, "I want a world covered with telescopes. Earth is only a chapter, less than that, a phrase, less still a word." So I think there are 2 questions there. One, the idea of influences and how you feel about it, and then the idea of word and the role of the poet, the role of the writer. If you can comment on that, I'll be glad. Thank you.
Sure. Great questions. I think influence is a really interesting one because obviously, for the most part in my schooling, we were mostly exposed to male writers and male saints and male scholars and, male poets and so on. And it was only really, I suppose, when I went to university that I really became aware of the, unbelievable lineage of Irish women poets that I'm very honoured to be a part of. And there's a brilliant new book. It's The Cambridge History of Irish Women Poets, edited by David Wheatley and Alva Darcy, that just came out last month, I think. That goes through just, the unbelievable work and innovation and experimentation of the wonderful Irish poets that are often forgotten, and there's a real movement here in Ireland to try and rectify that and to bring them to the surface. So I think on a certain level, having influences like my Irish Catholic convent education, being an Irish Catholic woman, girl growing up in that tradition, and particularly around confirmation time, and I'm sure those of you who are in Brazil who are Catholic, when you choose your confirmation name, it's probably very similar. You choose a saint that maybe in some way speaks to you or in some way you resonate with. And I chose Saint Therese of Lisieux, and she died when she was 25. Very, very disciplined person, would torture herself, would starve herself, etc. And when I read that when I was 12, I was I was confused that this was something that was to be lauded and celebrated and deemed to be holy. And so I think there is this dichotomy and this contrast between when I was growing up, the loving God that the New Testament would have us believe, and then this other God that seemed to maybe be a remnant of the Old Testament, but certainly someone who seemed to enjoy is the wrong word, but I'm going to use it, enjoy the suffering of others, or certainly that the suffering of women in particular would bring them closer to that union with Christ and that union with God and that almost holy marriage, if you like. So again, that was something that was very much part of my formation as a person and as a poet. And I think being exposed to religious language very young is a hugely impactful thing. Hearing all of those words and phrases that you would never normally get to access as a child, really sophisticated ideas, really disturbing images. And again, this, focus on suffering and guilt and shame. So I was fascinated then as a poet, again, having read Evan Boland, having read Paula Meehan, Elaine Feeney. We have such an amazing collection of contemporary Irish poets who definitely have inspired me. But that sense of trying to connect on some level with the women in the past who identified as Catholic and who didn't want to follow in the traditional role of mother and wife and, you know, sacrificing themselves, if you like, for others. That idea of a woman, you know, self-flagellating almost, and certainly we have that tradition in Ireland of the Irish mammy, and maybe you have a Brazil equivalent where, you know, the mother basically gives up her life and gives up her body and her ambitions to the family. And so, you know, we have alternatives now, you know, to some degree, but back then there was nothing. And so I was really interested in exploring the influence that those women had on me as a writer and on me as a person growing up, but equally trying to understand it in a more modern context too, that perhaps these women in these extreme actions were not well, and how we would view them now as opposed to how they were viewed then. So that was something that really, really inspired me. And I think I cannot deny my massive love for the Americans, particularly Plath and Sexton, Sharon Olds, Adrian Rich, Elizabeth Bishop, particularly Plath. I have a real just obsession with her. So I think it was something about the way that she so unabashedly and honestly confronted very difficult issues in relation to her experience of womanhood in an American context, and that very inspirational many, many years later for me in an Irish context. So very much influenced by those Americans too, I have to say, in conjunction with, you know, my Irish lineage. And the second question, Gisele? Maybe we've both forgotten this.
It was about the word. I think there's something there about courage. Yes. What you're proposing is very brave. Being a woman writer is a brave attitude. But also when you say, I want the world covered with telescopes. Earth is only a chapter, less than that, a phrase, less still a word. And then I'm thinking about William Blake's verse on to see the world in a grain of sand, which I think is what poets do. And at the same time, bring a whole new dimension to historical facts. So you're bringing up all these historical women in your writing is really braving many, in at least two senses. So I'm very happy to hear your confirmation on that. But also being a writer and through Eat or We Both Starve, talking about refusal. I think the book is about refusal. It regards refusal of what the world has to offer the way it does. And as you say, in A Litany for Survival, Victoria Kennefick, which for those watching us can be read in Carcanet Press's website. And I quote, the poems in this collection concern the struggle, growing up to die, the grief at losing loved ones, the battle against constant change in childhood and young adulthood, the shock of physical development, not to mention the chaos and the certainty of our collective futures. And the poems do what they can in containing and explaining these existential concerns. It's my survival strategy, and I loved this passage so much because I think for the writer, writing is a survival strategy. For maybe you want to talk more about that. But given the fact that many of the poems from Eat or We Both Starve signal to the matter of identity, I think you're always talking about identity there. In your opinion, do you think humor has a significant role in poems that are deeply existential? I found humor in many of your poems, from the expected behavior in the poem Supper, for example, to the tragic swimming lesson, which I saw much of myself there. I almost had the same on the beach once.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
No, it was a great relief reading that in your book. And the where's the humor there? When you say, well, nothing matters. You know, it didn't matter if I liked cats or if I had done this or that. So in the seventh line, and I think the most humorous one, I don't know if that was meant to be humorous or not, maybe you can tell us. In the poem, Cork schoolgirl considers the GPO doubling like 2016. When in the seventh line we read, and I quote, "I love all the men of history sacrificing themselves for Ireland, for me, these rebel Jesuses. I want to kiss them all, and I do. I kiss all those boys goodbye." Wow, that's a very deep poem as the other ones, but full of humor. I laughed when I read.
Good. I'm so glad.
Was that meant to be humorous or just came out? Tell us about your creative process, please. I'm so curious.
Yeah, I love to laugh, and I like funny people, and I like being funny, and I love funny poetry. I'm a great fan of the British poet Emily Berry, and particularly her first collection, Dear Boy, which I hugely recommend. It's very, very deadpan, very dry, very witty. And I remember reading that after doing a workshop with Caroline Duffy and Gillian Clarke, two British poets of great renown. Gillian Clarke is Welsh. And I just remember laughing. I was in Waterstones, I think in Scotland maybe, and I was reading the book and I was laughing aloud. And it was such a glorious experience. And I remember having that same experience with T.S. Eliot as well. That there are such dry moments of humor and observation, and this sense of connection you feel with a poet when they notice something ridiculous or say something ridiculous that you may have already noted and thought you were the only one. So there's that kind of shared relief, I think, about connecting with somebody else in a humorous way or absurdist way. I also think when you're dealing with very difficult subjects, and some of the subjects I do explore, a lot of the reason why I write is to just say the unsayable, because it just seems it's a compulsion I have to just say it out. And it was poetry that provided a vehicle for that. And until I found that very young, it's very difficult to know where to put it. So I think humor is a very, very important part of my practice. And it is a reminder for me not to take myself too seriously and not to take my sense of myself too seriously, because I'm fascinated by my own identity and my own humanity and my own existence as this random Irish person called Victoria, and the things that I'm going through and what they mean and what I'm learning in the world and what the universe is telling me. And occasionally I need to just go, hold on, this is all so ridiculous. That we're just on this ball spinning through space. And there is that necessary, I think, levity that even in the darkest of times and even in the most bleak of moments, there is humor. And it is a survival strategy, for so many people. And certainly, and I'm sure it's very similar in Brazilian context, for, the difficult history that we have, particularly around the famine and around our colonial past, that a lot of how Irish people dealt with that was through humor and subversion and, winks and, subterfuge. So I think that's a very, very important part of what I do, not only for myself, but also for readers, that, there is this line throughout the collection of humor, because it can get pretty heavy. So it's kind of an attempt to balance things out as well. And I always laugh myself when I'm writing them. So and then it's really strange, because sometimes when I read the poems initially, I cry. So I remember crying reading the first time I read aloud Cork Schoolgirl. Yet knowing it was funny, there's just such a connection between, tragedy and comedy. And I feel like that's something that I really enjoy skirting around and maneuvering around very much. And it is, humor is essential to my survival as a person, for sure. And also defense too. I think there's definitely an element of that sometimes things go a little deep. So I kind of put a little wall up there of humor to deflect to. So I think there's a lot going on with it. And I'm really glad that you found them funny. That's like one of the greatest compliments.
Yeah, I loved, and I loved the poem. There's this poem now. I have to look at the book again. The teacher is the teacher starts. Oh, there's this boy. I wanted. I laughed so much as I read that poem. I'm sure most teachers have always had that moment in which they wish they weren't there, or some funny situation. For example, the poem, I think it's the one before the last. The poem is called "Open Your Mouth," and it gives the title to the anthology. We have the image of Krishna and his mother portrayed in experimental words on the page, and that's lovely. That's also full of humor, like. So I had a great time, and I'm sure everyone reading the book will enjoy it a lot. But if you could give us some hint on your creative process, like when did you start? When did you start writing poetry?
Sure. I really think I read poetry from a very early age. My parents would have recited poetry to me. My dad was a big fan of Robert Service, so he really liked heavily rhyming poems. And my mum was really into the Romantics and Yeats and Heaney to a degree. But I probably started writing when I was about 7 or 8, and a lot of my early writing would have been, pastiches, like would have been really bad copies of Yeats and Heaney. And trying to emulate them. Walter Delamere as well. I loved him when I was a child. Really loved his language. And then Gerard Manley Hopkins when I was a little bit older, in terms of just the innovation and experimentation. I found his poetry so undeniably moving. So I think I got a lot of attention from writing. I didn't have very many other talents, so I was very pleased to get attention from writing, and so that was really encouraging. So in terms of my process, it's interesting. Earlier you mentioned research, and as I suppose a recovering academic, I love researching, and it really it nourishes me, and it's actually what I do to relax. And I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that. It's the writing bit is a bit harder, but the researching is like a comfort zone. So oftentimes, my husband's an ecologist, and so he might tell me something. A lot of my poems in my newer collection are very much around animals and nature, and particularly swans. And he might tell me a fact about them, and then suddenly that leads me down this rabbit hole of research. And so I initially just write reams. I have to write out longhand the research, just reams and reams of facts about swans, say, or about the saints. I remember I went through a few books about the saints individually, and then collections around different stories of the saints, and then different articles people had written about the saints. There was a brilliant one by Hilary Mantel that I found really inspirational. And I just write it all down. And then it's almost like I have to rest for a little while. And then there'll be a word or a sentence or a phrase or sometimes a picture. And that kind of sparks something. And I don't ever refer to the notes again. I never look at them again. So it's kind of almost working out something, working through something, and then discarding it all and finding whatever it is I was looking for. That's one way. And then the other way is very rarely. It happened with Beached Whale, actually. I was just going to sleep. It happened with Cork Schoolgirl as well. And the poem just came to me. That's very rare and very precious, but that does happen too. But it often happens when I have been working really hard on the research and working on other poems, that my brain is kind of warmed up, if you like.
That's great. I mean, I had heard about poets who wake up to write poetry, not the other way around. So you're the first one. You're right.
I'm just about to go and it's like, oh, damn, I have to get up.
And I'm also curious about how Flannery O'Connor and Frank O'Connor entered your life in terms of research, and how does it reflect upon your poetry, or doesn't it?
I'm going to be so, yeah, it does. It really does. And I'm going to be really honest about this. I finished my master's and I did a teaching training course, and I went to work in a secondary school here. So students between 12 to 18 years of age. And don't tell anyone, obviously, or my students, I hated it. I was like, I want to go back to college. I just want to go back to the academic life. And so I had planned to do PhD on Sylvia Plath. And I went to my chosen supervisor, Dr. Lee Jenkins, a brilliant academic and a brilliant supervisor. And she said, oh, I've just supervised one on Plath, and I'm not sure if that's something that if there's something at the moment that needs to be said about her. I didn't really have a clear idea of where I wanted to go anyway. So I was reading Flannery O'Connor at the time, and I loved her work, mostly because at the time I thought there couldn't be anybody more different to me and my writing. Because I thought at the time, I suppose I was quite sentimental in my writing, I felt, and I was working really hard to try and, I suppose, include that sentimentality, not deny it, but equally make it, a poetic experience rather than, just an emotional one. Although there is value in that, of course. So I decided to do my PhD on Flannery O'Connor, just maybe the day after. I was like, I'm reading her, I love her. It's fate, I'll just go for it. It was that, sudden. And Frank O'Connor, I'd always loved his short stories, and being from Cork, he was quite a significant figure. And I was really interested then in their connections, not only obviously the names, which made for snappy titles, but also there was such a huge affinity around place and about what it meant to be from Cork or to be from the American South, which was quite separated in terms of region during the 1950s and 60s. So they would have been very regional writers, very contained within that identity, and really struggling to move beyond it. I mean, Frank O'Connor taught at Harvard. He famously rejected Sylvia Plath's application to do summer school. So I got the Plath influence connection in there. But I think in terms of what that discipline in studying them both gave me was, I think, a real appreciation for drama. And I'm quite a dramatic person, and I really appreciate drama, particularly in the art that I enjoy. And I think something about looking at the way in which Flannery O'Connor in particular paints her figures so dramatically, so almost cartoonishly, in order to express something very difficult, that she has that humor. I have laughed till I cried reading Flannery O'Connor. And she's not afraid. She's ruthless in exposing hypocrisy, in exposing the true nature of humanity in all of its brutality. And so I think, in spite of myself, I really thought that if I ever met Flannery O'Connor, that she would hate me. So that was weirdly something that I was like, I have to understand her, or I have to she wouldn't like my writing. I need to unpack her. And this, I think, really led to the realization that I absolutely love her work, but I've learned so much from her. And I think I was far more like her than I was willing to admit at the time. So she's, I think looking back, there are so many obviously problematic elements to her story in terms of race and where she lived and where she grew up. But I think she's an extraordinary writer, an extraordinary character. And I was really lucky to have had that opportunity to spend time with her work, because I think my book wouldn't have been the same if I hadn't had that experience.
Thank you. Great. Let me just ask you one final question. So before we start our reading, I'm curious to hear from you whether you think the role of the poet in hypermodern times, which are these fragmentary times we're living, has the role of the writer, the poet, changed or is it the same? And how do we make readers more aware as we write? Or what is your reflection upon writing today?
That's a brilliant question, and one I think as a teacher of poetry as well that I find challenging, because for me, I can't imagine a world without poetry, and it is a safe space for me, but also a place where I can question very difficult emotions, experiences, and explore them within this contained aesthetic space. There's a great safety in that, as well as risk, I think. So in terms of the role of the poet, I think on one level it hasn't changed at all. In terms of, I think of poets for me always being truth tellers, of being aware of the more difficult but essential aspects of life. You know, when you think about when people read poetry, you know, at funerals, at baptisms, at weddings, at graduations, when they're in love, you know, when our humanity is at its most intense, that's when we need poetry. And I think that will never go away. And I do believe that, you know, the internet provides such an amazing opportunity to encourage those and welcome those who wouldn't otherwise maybe have felt welcome or felt part of the conversation into the world of poetry, which is the world. It is, you know, an exploration of what it means to be alive and to be human. And so I often find when, for example, even, you know, if I'm certainly at the beginning of the pandemic when I was doing readings with a lot of other poets online, and I would send the links, you know, to all of my family and friends and anybody, because they were, you know, at home like everyone was. And certainly at the beginning, I remember getting so many messages from people who would normally have never attended a poetry reading, being genuinely moved and saying, oh, I really liked that poet, I'm going to get her book, or I really enjoyed that poem, I'm going to check it out. And so I think people are being genuinely surprised by the fact that they love poetry and that it spoke to them. And I think it's a very rare person that isn't moved by a poem, their poem. You know, we all have our little collection of poems that are, you know, our go-to poems. And I think when you encounter that, there's no going back, really. But I'm a really strong believer in the fact that certainly, you know, bringing out a book during the pandemic and looking at fiction writers bringing out their books during the pandemic, and the amount of marketing and the amount of publicity that is given, quite rightly, to the brilliant work of fiction is not given to poetry. And I've often gone into bookshops and said, oh, where's your poetry section? And they say it doesn't sell. And I say, well, if it's not here, how can people buy it? So I think it's quite a systemic issue, that this sense of poetry being rarefied or being exclusive, which, you know, nothing could be further from the truth, I think. But it's about us being more open and being more innovative and using the platforms that are available to us, and, you know, go the Instagram poets and go whoever uses what, you know, TikTok or whatever, whatever way works in terms of reaching the people that need to hear what you have to say.
Excellent. I'm glad you are optimistic about the possibilities.
I am.
That's great. So why don't we try and bring some humor or some of your poetry? Those of you who are watching us can find a PDF file through the link in the video description, in the YouTube description. So I will let you choose from the 3 poems we had earlier selected. Selfie, we have Smell Dating, and we have Hunger Strikes Victoria Kennefick. And one idea is you read your original, then I read the translation, but also if you want to make any comments about the poems, please feel free. We'll be super glad to hear.
Okay. You're very kind. This is so exciting, honestly, just the privilege to have your work read so closely and then to be translated is just, it's wonderful. And I'm so grateful to you, Gisele, for doing such a wonderful job. I'd like to start with Selfie, if that's okay. So will I read it and then you read the translation? I can't wait. I can't wait to hear that. So it's interesting because I think with poems, I certainly found that sometimes, you know, you write a poem and it's of a particular moment, but it's only later that resonances in that poem become very, very strong and maybe very, very applicable to the moment, which makes, of course, poetry universal and timeless. So this poem, Selfie, you know, isn't a lockdown poem, but I think for me, it really resonates with that experience of being in your own body, stuck in your own house, without having any relief from that or release from that. No matter how many other people are in your house, you're still very much without the distractions that normally would relieve you from having to deal with one's own identity. There's also a really lovely film poem that the director, his name escapes me now, which is terrible, but he did a brilliant job of making a film poem out of this. I think if you Google Selfie film poem, it should come up on YouTube. I'll send you the link, Gisele, and maybe you can share it. So this is Selfie. Sitting alone in the house, eating my fingernails, watching the sky move away. The room is full. Versions of me crouching on the floor, balancing on the windowsill, reclining on the pout of my lower lip, asleep in the crease of my eyelid. Not alone, with myself, a snare I have been running from. I do not live the way humans are supposed to. Compare my face to others you know. I fall short. An embarrassing fringe. No matter what face I try on, it's exhausting. All versions shake our heads. There is so much to do until we think we are not what we are. Victoria's. I see those letters written on envelopes I know are for me because of the shape of that word, that greedy V. It's two arms open wide, ready to accept anything.
Autorretrato. Enquanto me sento, sozinha em casa, roendo as unhas, observando o céu se retirar, a sala está cheia. São versões de mim, que se agacham no chão, equilibrando-se no peitoril da janela, deixando-se estar no beiço que faço com o lábio inferior. Dormentemente dobram-se na pálpebra, não só comigo mesma, uma armadilha de que tenho escapado. Não vivo da forma como os humanos devem viver. Basta comparar o meu rosto com o de outros que você conhece. Fico aquém. Uma fronteira constrangedora. Não importa que rosto eu experimente. É desgastante. Todas as versões se recusam. Há muito a fazer, até que pensamos não ser o que somos. Vitórias. Entendi aquela carta escrita em envelopes. Sei que são para mim, por causa da forma, da palavra, do ávido V. Os seus dois braços bem abertos, prontos para aceitar tudo.
That was amazing. Oh my gosh. That was incredible. Thank you so much. It sounds amazing. It's got the right sound and it just sounds brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's incredible.
I made it a bit more. And
I loved it.
I have to say, there's a lot we can talk about translation here. For example, the title Selfie. I could leave selfie because we say selfie in Brazil.
Okay.
Most people in Portugal will also say selfie. But then No. This is a lot more than just a selfie. This is a portrait. But okay, I'll let you talk about the poems. I'm just.
Oh no, it's a fascinating art, the art of translation. I just think it's an extraordinary thing to do. I'm so grateful for translators for all of the literature they make available to us.
Well, I had a great time translating your poems. It was really a lot of fun, so thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad. That's great. That's brilliant. This next one I'm going to read is called Smell Dating, and it was for somebody asked, can you write a poem about smell or with the theme of smell? And again, I was like, the theme of smell. And I think it's something that, even today in class with my students, we were talking about smell and sensuality, and we all know how evocative smell is. So it was an attempt to highlight that in a more modern context, maybe. And again, strangely relevant to these pandemic times. Smell dating. They came in 10 tiny transparent plastic bags, the torn armpits of strangers' t-shirts still humming with their owners' undeodorized sweat. Trust yourself, the website said. Your nose knows. In the kitchen, I take each sample out, unfurl it like a napkin at a fancy restaurant, hold each swatch to my nose, huff deeply. This one smells of bubblegum, another of the sea, still another of rotting wood. The white tea they sent me hung from my body for 3 days, grew slack like old skin. I tried to embrace my natural scent, but was careful where I went, didn't exercise. Leaving the samples to pine on the table, I go to the bedroom, pull back the covers, press the pillow to my face. Surrender yourself to the poignant experience of body odor, the website said. It smells like me.
Cheira a encontro. Vieram em 10 pequenas sacolas plásticas e as camisetas com os dejetos das axilas de estranhos cantarolando suor sem o desodorizante de seus proprietários. Confie em si mesmo, dizia o portal. O seu nariz sabe. Na cozinha, apanho cada amostra e a desdobro, feito guardanapo de restaurante chique. Seguro cada exemplar junto ao nariz e dou profundas baforadas. Este aqui cheira a chiclete, o outro a mar, e ainda este outro a madeira podre. A camiseta branca que me mandaram permaneceu em meu corpo por 3 dias. Ficou folgada, feito pele velha. Tentei abraçar o meu cheiro natural, mas fui cautelosa no rumo. Nem me exercitei. Ao deixar as amostras definhando na mesa, vou ao quarto, puxo as cobertas, aperto o travesseiro ao rosto. Renda-se à excruciante experiência dos odores corpóreos, dizia o portal. Isso tem no meu cheiro.
Amazing. Amazing. Sorry, I had a slight technical issue there. My plug wasn't plugged in properly, so apologies for that in the middle. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it true? Is it possible that people, I've never checked, is there such a website?
Oh, yes, it's true. Most of what I write about that sort of stuff is true. Yeah, really bizarre, isn't it? But I suppose, there was this sense that, we rely so much, with the more modern online dating apps like Tinder and so on, it's very much visual based. And this company argued that, the pheromones that we sweat or excrete or whatever, that they are much more indicative of attraction than simply a picture. So this is what they tried out. I don't know if it's still going. It would be interesting to see. To see. But smell, I suppose, It's very important in a significant other. You have to kind of at least be neutral about their smell, if not actually genuinely like it. This last poem that I'm going to read, and the one that Gisele translated, is the last one of the Hunger Strike series. So it's a broken sequence, I call it, that goes through the whole book, and as Gisele discussed earlier, engages with saints and martyrs throughout the Middle Ages and beyond, who engaged in very extreme behaviours, either to avoid the traditional roles that were expected of women, or to, on some level, communicate or emulate Christ, or a bit of both, or more, or something else. So this is the last one, and it's called Hunger Strikes Victoria Kennefick. She punches her stomach loose, blind naked like a baby mole. In the shower, she cannot wash herself clean the way she'd like, rid herself of useless molecules. Would that she could strip her bones, be something neat, complete, useful. To eat or not to eat, switch table sides, stuff cheese sandwiches and chocolate blocks into a wide, moist orifice, or alternatively, zip that mouth closed like a jacket, a body already contained within. It doesn't need to feed. But I have set a table for us all a feast, on a vast, smooth cloth already soiled. Let's take a seat, eat our fill. You know you want to. Dig in.
Thank you. I just noticed I have skipped the last lines. So the translation is really incomplete for the
That's appropriate, yes, I think.
So, Greve de Fome, de Victoria Kennefick. Ela soca o próprio estômago vazio, numa verdade nua e crua, feito filhote de topeira. No banho, não consegue se lavar limpinha como gostaria, desfazer-se das moléculas inúteis. Se pudesse, ela se desfazia dos ossos e se deixaria tornar algo puro, completo, útil. Comer ou não comer, virar os lados da mesa, meter sanduíches de queijo e barras de chocolate num amplo orifício úmido, ou então fechar a boca como se fecha uma jaqueta, um corpo já encerrado em si mesmo, não precisa de alimento, mas pus a mesa para todos nós. And this is how I strangely finished the translation.
It's perfect.
The translation, I thought, but there's something missing. And then I checked. Now that I heard you speak the poem, there's something missing. Yeah, there's a fourth of page missing, which I promised to complete later.
Well, it sounded amazing. Thank you so much. It's absolutely wonderful.
Thank you very much, Victoria. We are so happy and honored to have your presence with us. I think it's a great opportunity to get to know what's being written nowadays in Ireland and how international your language is. I mean, it's you're writing from Ireland, but is that enough to make Irish poetry? Is that enough for us to call it Irish? I mean, it's international. You're talking about many topics that are important to many women all over the world, and not just women, to many individuals. So I'm very happy that we could have your readings and talk. And Mariana is reminding me here that in Portuguese, your name is Victory, like in English.
Wow,
so,
love it.
We have kind of double meaning when we refer to your name. And she also says how difficult it must be for people to become vegetarian in Brazil, because Brazil is a growing, we've been growing cattle for many years.
Yes.
Meat. But I think the tendency nowadays. I think the tendency is that people get more and more aware of what it means to eat other animals, especially red meat. And there's also some talk here. I'm reading the chat in YouTube, and there's also some talk about how important happiness in poetry is through humor or even in tragedy. It's really necessary that we are optimistic and happy, particularly nowadays, even though we might have
Yes.
tragic themes like the pandemic, but and the many topics that appear in your poems, we can still deal with them in a funny way, in a light way. And even writing, I think the process of writing and being read for the writer is a way out.
Absolutely. It's a relief. You can kind of give it all to somebody else, give it all to your readers. It's a great channel, I think.
Thank you. So for us to wrap up, what is your final message for future readers of Victoria Kennefick, or just readers or audience watching us? How could we wrap it up?
I think ultimately, as you say, Gisele, it doesn't really matter what poets speak to you or resonate with you. It's about finding the poet that does, no matter where they're from. And it's interesting, I think, it's fascinating for me that there's a group in Brazil that are interested in Irish studies and talking and learning about Irish writers, and equally that there are people here that are fascinated by, you know, the wonderful Brazilian writers and poets that you have. And it just is such a wonderful way of unifying communities, as you say, and realizing that there's far more that we have in common than than differences, basically, that we have so much in common. And that I hope when reading my work, no matter where you are and no matter what your first language might be, that you'll find resonances, and that might lead you further down a path towards discovering more about yourself or what it means to be a person in this crazy world that we're in. So I'm really grateful for any of you who have read my work. It really is a privilege and an honor. I'm so grateful to you, Gisele, and to Mariana and to Victor for making it all happen on the technical side, and to everyone listening for this wonderful, lovely opportunity on a kind of dull Tuesday evening here in County Kerry. To have the opportunity to talk to you all has been really special.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Once again, we'll be in touch. Mariana, do you want to join us for a final word?
Yes, okay, thank you so much, Gisele and Victoria. I loved listening to both the reading and the translation. It just kept my mind going wild, and I was thinking especially about the senses in your poetry, sight, smell, taste, the food. And it was so interesting. Apart from the imagery, of course, the senses are evoked while reading. And I would like to thank you both for this wonderful webinar. And Victoria, hopefully we will meet in person sometime soon.
That would be lovely.
Or in Ireland. And it was very lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care now, everybody.
You too. And thank you, G.
Thanks, Mariana.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
And thank you all for watching us. And we will keep you posted about the next ABEI Webinar Series. Okay, so bye-bye. Thank you, Victor.